Hello, and welcome to another episode of Team Blush. This is part 11 in the KA24E Turbo series. As you can see, we are standing in the engine bay of the S13. We have a lot of housekeeping to do in this episode. We're going to be doing some general cleaning of the engine bay. We have to remove our battery tray and ready for some intercooler piping that we're going to need to start routing through here. And there is still some unused stuff in here that we're going to be needing to get rid of before going ahead and installing our engine back into the car. Off camera, we went ahead and installed our manual transmission onto the new engine. There is still a few more things to do in this episode on that engine before we go ahead and get it ready to install back in the car. There's a lot of little stuff to get done and really no rhyme or reason in which order we go ahead and tackle it. Think we're going to go ahead and get the rest of the little stuff done on the engine before we go ahead and jump into the engine bay and start getting things cleaned up. We'll see you there, and who knows, by the end of this episode, we may just put this engine back in the car. Our first item on the small list of things to get done to finish up this engine before installing it back into the car is to run an oil feed to the turbo that we have installed. This is done with the means of an oil filter sandwich plate. This screws in with a threaded adapter into the oil filter location on the side of the block, and this is going to allow us to tap in with what's called an NPT fitting to run an oil feed line from it to our turbo. This oil filter sandwich plate will also allow us in the future to add an oil pressure gauge that you will be seeing in a future episode. That oil feed line was run up as neatly as we could possibly manage to the top of the turbo, where we removed this little red cap. Removing that little red cap allowed us to install an oil restrictor fitting. We're actually unsure if oil restrictors are a standard when installing an oil feed line on a turbo, but in our application it's stated by the manufacturer that it is required. This little oil restrictor, as far as we're aware, is to do exactly as it states and restrict the oil from the feed inlet into the turbo to mitigate blowing out the oil seals in the internals of the turbo. That oil restrictor then allowed us to install a very important 45-degree angle NPT fitting for our oil feed line. With the location of our turbo, running the oil feed without that 45-degree fitting would result in the line actually getting kinked underneath the hood of the car, and that is really just a precursor, because at the end of this episode you'll see just how tight a lot of these clearances under the hood are going to be. Because our engine mounts were looking pretty tired, we decided on getting and bolting up some new polyurethane mounts. These should be a little more stiff than the OEM mounts, especially considering our OEM mounts were cracked and degrading. In regards to these new mounts, either using 2 plates or 4 plates should allow for a very slight difference in how stiff they are. We honestly just decided to use all 4 that were provided with each mount. Next on the list was to install our belts for our power steering and our alternator. And we've actually had these belts laying around for, no joke, 2 years now. These were a gift from our parents that we originally planned to put on the engine that we pulled out of the car, but the belts on that engine were never bad enough to really warrant it. Who knows, maybe these belts were the catalyst for this entire turbo build. The final thing we needed to install on our engine is a new starter, and we say new starter because the S13 block and the D21 block do use different starters. The starter for the S13 has a longer snout because the S13 block has a casting design that has a designated spot that the starter bolts onto. On the D21 block, it does not have this and instead opts for a shorter snout on the starter that is just directly bolted to the transmission bell housing. From what we're aware, you can use the S13 starter with a longer snout on a D21 block application that is just bolted straight to the transmission bell housing. But in order to take up the space for that longer snout, you must use spacers in between the bolts to account for that difference in length. And we really just didn't want to deal with that, so we went ahead and purchased a refurbished D21 starter. You also may have noticed in the footage that the connector for the S13 starter and the connector for the D21 starter are different. So because our car still uses the S13 starter plug, we simply cut that off of the S13 starter and then crimped it onto the D21 starter. With the engine all done and ready to go back in the engine bay, it's now time to prep the engine bay itself. We decided to just go ahead and tackle the most nerve-wracking and hardest thing to do first, and that was to remove this rusty battery tray from the car and ready to make the hole for our intercooler piping. In order to remove this battery tray, you must locate all of the spot welds securing it to the car. You can find other videos on how to locate and drill spot welds to supplement our footage, but the simplified version is just to strip back the paint, or in our case, rust, from the battery tray to locate small indents that indicate where a spot weld might be. Those spot welds are then drilled out, ideally with a spot weld drill bit, and less ideally with a drill bit. The goal is to make as few holes as you possibly can in the very thin sheet metal underneath the tray itself. Unfortunately, inevitably, accidents do happen. Like we said, the metal underneath this battery tray is so thin, so if you get even the slightest bit rushed in your work, you will just completely smoke through that metal. And as you can see, the rust in that upper left portion of the battery tray made it absolutely impossible to find any of the spot welds under it. We practically ended up just cutting the whole thing out. The battery tray is not only held on with spot welds on the topmost portion, it's also held on with spot welds on the underside lip area. In order to get to those spot welds, we just had to unbolt this air conditioner component and kind of push it aside just enough to be able to drill the tabs on that underside lip. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the footage of us drilling these tabs because of the lack of space in the engine bay. We were literally scrunched up between the cross member and the air conditioner condenser while drilling these out. And with persistence, patience, and more patience, the battery tray came out. If you're doing this yourself, be patient. We tore through a few spots in that thin metal underneath from prying, from just having slight bouts of impatience. We didn't tear through many spots, but even just the slightest bit of impatience and a little bit of torque will tear through that metal super quickly. Now that we've gotten that rusted battery tray out of the way, we can go ahead and drill our 3-inch hole for our 2.5-inch intercooler piping. We questioned whether or not we would have to relocate the windshield washer fluid reservoir that's underneath the metal here. Luckily, it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. And then finally, after a lot of consideration, we went ahead and stripped back the paint and the rust on the more chewed up areas of this portion of the engine bay, just so that we could lay down a coat of fresh paint, and also off camera we laid down a couple layers of clear coat. At this moment, we really didn't have the means to prep this properly or paint it properly or even make it look really that nice. We just simply wanted to mitigate some of that rusting, even if at the sacrifice of it not looking the greatest. Trust us, this was a hard decision to make. There's other points in the engine bay we did this as well. But in the end, we think it was for the best. We just have to keep reminding ourselves that this is a work in progress. We do plan to pull this motor relatively soon after we finish getting this series done, and that will be for prepping the car for a full paint job in the future, as well as properly tending to some of these sorts of things. Because we were about to power wash the engine bay, and because we no longer needed them due to purchasing our new poly mounts, we removed the engine mounts in order to wash the subframe. That then led to a short little walk outside the garage where the car finally got some fresh air and sunlight for what has honestly seemed like ages. And prior to power washing the engine bay, we took some engine degreaser to it and let it sit there for a while just to chew up some of that nastier grime and grit in the bay. We did not only power wash the bay, there was a ton more cleaning done with rags and brushes off camera. We honestly figured that'd be pretty boring to watch, so we didn't film it. But once said and done, we spent more than a few hours trying to get it looking somewhat presentable for when we drop in our new engine. Once we finished cleaning the engine bay, we moved to removing the charcoal canister from the bay. This is no longer needed because in the prior episode we deleted our EGR system. After removing this though, we have to follow this gas tank vent line all the way back underneath the rear of the car and to a small check valve. This check valve is located just above your rear passenger side axle and requires a vacuum to properly vent the gas tank. Since we no longer have the charcoal canister assembly to provide vacuum, we need to disconnect and relocate this line to continue to allow the tank to vent properly. We decided just to zip tie this line back along the gas tank seam as far back as we could to the back side of the car. And we ended up just putting a temporary piece of cut up coffee filter on the very tip of it just to keep particulate out. We're going to get an actual filter for it in the future. You can just use a small lawnmower engine fuel filter for this and it'll work just fine. If you really want to go the extra mile, as we did off camera, you can go ahead and disconnect this hard line from where it connects via a hose just underneath the firewall. That will clean up the bay just that little bit more, and since it's not being utilized anymore, you might as well. The final thing we needed to remove from the car was this resonator box thing underneath the driver's side front fender. This is in the way for our intercooler piping, and once it's removed, you can see that Nissan oh so thoughtfully already pre-drilled a hole for us to use for that intercooler piping. We'll probably have to enlarge this a little bit in the future, but we'll figure that out whenever we install our intercooler. Alright, well there we go. It seems like that was the last thing we needed to get done on the engine before we go ahead and install it back into the car. Behind the camera we just have a slew of parts that we've been looking over to see if we have forgotten anything. And with all of our lists, all of our labeling and everything, we don't think that we're missing anything. We are running out of daylight pretty quick here, so off camera we need to zip tie this motor mount together because of the way that these are designed. Whenever you take the nut off the bottom side of the motor mount, the whole assembly just kind of falls apart. So we're going to have to zip tie that off camera. And here in just a second, really, you're going to be seeing a time lapse of us getting the engine back into the car. We're going to try and do this on our own. We might not be able to. We might have to call in a little bit of help. But yep, it is definitely time to get this engine back into the car, and it's a really crazy feeling. Let's jump right into it. Hopefully it is easier than we think it's going to be. This definitely might be a little bit tougher to do than getting it out of the car. Well, there you have it. The engine is back in the car, and surely by that time lapse that you just watched, you'll know that this was the easiest thing to do in the world. Just kidding. While this isn't an impossible task to do on your own, it was definitely a chore. It took us probably in the range of about 4 hours to wrangle this thing back into the engine bay. And now that we do have this back in the engine bay, our anxiety is again through the roof. It seems like this whole engine build and engine series has just been a roller coaster of emotions. We'll show you here why that is the case. As you can see, we did have clearance issues with our turbo hitting our distributor coil when we were putting it into the car. As well, with our turbo clearance issues, our oil drain is coming into contact with some of the hard lines that come off of the air conditioning compressor. And if you take a look at the clearance between our brake master cylinder and the back of our turbo housing, you'll notice that it's going to be a huge undertaking to fabricate the downpipe that routes through this location. Not only do we have to worry about the brake master cylinder clearance, a little bit further down we do see that there is an air conditioning hose that is also going to get in the way. So all of that in conjunction with the rapidly changing weather currently has our anxiety, like we said, through the roof. We will figure it out. We are trying our absolute best to retain air conditioning on this vehicle. But if it comes down to it, we will delete it if there's nothing else that can be done. That being said, we've seen other individuals do this pretty much exact same setup on their S13s, and we have seen that they have retained air conditioning, and they have also fabricated their downpipe to get around the master cylinder and the AC line in the rear. With all that said, we think we're going to wrap the episode here. We've got some things to look at off camera and figure out. Thanks a ton for watching to this point in the video. If you have reached here, it always helps with our analytics when people watch to the very end. If you have any questions, concerns, or just want to hang out, check out our Instagram at team.blush. That's the best way to get into contact with us. We hope to see you in the next episode on the channel. Depending on what time it is for you when you are watching this video, we hope that you have a good day or night. And as always, take it easy.